En nombre de la Universidad Peruana de Ciencias Aplicadas, UPC, expresamos a todos los aquí presentes el saludo y la bienvenida institucionales al segundo día de Congreso Internacional de Educadores UPC 2016, titulado Innovación en Educación. La UPC, en línea con su sólido compromiso con el desarrollo social del país, busca a través de este Congreso seguir contribuyendo a la mejora de la calidad educativa y al fortalecimiento del sector de educación básica en el Perú. Les recordamos acercarse durante el día a la zona de registro para confirmar las aulas donde les toca sus talleres de mañana. Para dar inicio al programa académico del segundo día, invitamos a la señora Anita Sherwin-Hamer, quien tiene a su cargo la conferencia El poder de la evaluación para el aprendizaje. La señora Anita Sherwin es consultora de Curriculum Service Canadá International Service. Actualmente supervisa la evaluación de libros para el Ministerio de Educación en Ontario y ha trabajado con profesores y directores en la concientización sobre el impacto de las prácticas de evaluación apropiadas en instrucción y aprendizaje. Sherwin-Hamer tiene experiencia en liderazgo instruccional y el desarrollo de comunidades de aprendizaje profesional.
Buenos dias, everyone. I am really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about the power of assessment for learning. There has been so much research done about this approach in the last 20 years, and I'm really excited to share some of those findings with you. I think especially at a conference like this one, where we're focusing on innovation, it's very important that we consider this approach to assessment, because this approach changes the dynamic between teacher and student. The teacher becomes mentor and the student becomes mentee. I think it's an appropriate relationship for 21st century learners. Now, the reason why I think this approach is so powerful is threefold. First of all, it's very doable. It doesn't create an extra burden for the teacher. It gets results. There are many studies that show that student achievement increases and motivation increases. And it's empowering. It empowers the student to develop the capacity to become self-regulated, self-monitoring, and a lifelong learner. What more could we ask for? Before I go any further, I'd like you to think a little bit about your own beliefs about assessment. So if you turn to your handout, I believe it was the last handout in your package. It looks like this. And you can see the title of the keynote on the top there. El poder de la evaluación para el aprendizaje. I'm trying. You'll see some belief statements at the very beginning of the handout. And I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to read those statements and to develop an opinion about them. Once you've done that, if you would just turn to a partner and talk for a moment to see if you and your partner agree or disagree. So take a moment to read those statements now and then have a short conversation with someone near you. Now, I hope I don't disturb the people who are contemplating and discussing, but for those of you who don't have the handout, I'm going to read the belief statements to you so that you can think about them. Because really, I will want you to be thinking about these throughout the presentation. First statement. It is important to grade student work early and often for maximum learning. It is important to grade student work early and often for maximum learning. Statement number 2. The main source of feedback in the classroom should be the teacher. The main source of feedback in the classroom should be the teacher. Number 3, providing grades and comments on student work is the best way to support students in reaching their learning goals. Providing grades and comments on student work is the best way to support students in reaching their learning goals. And finally, allowing students to resubmit assignments promotes poor work habits. Allowing students to resubmit assignments promotes poor work habits. Just a little more discussion and then we'll move on. I'm going to bring you back to those statements at the end of the presentation. And what I'm hoping is that I will create a little bit of cognitive dissonance so that you might actually change your mind about some of your beliefs. We'll see what happens by the end of the presentation. Now, my remarks this morning have been divided into 3 sections. Why do we do assessment for learning? Where does it fit in? How do we do it? So let's talk just for a minute about why we bother to do this kind of assessment. Well, we do this kind of assessment because the function of assessment has changed. We used to follow an industrial model where we really used assessment as a process just to rank, sort, and group individuals for their role in the industrial world. We also used assessment as a process to accredit individuals. We are now following a 21st century model where we still use assessment as a process to accredit, but we also use it as a process to ensure accountability. And most importantly, we use it as a process to improve instruction and learning. And assessment for learning supports that last function. Assessment for learning is not just somebody's terrific idea. Those of you who heard me yesterday talked about the fact that we have to make evidence-based decisions. You can't just do something because somebody thinks it's a great thing to do. Assessment for learning is research-based. There are many studies that show that instruction improves, learning improves, and students develop the capacity to be self-directed, lifelong learners. Now, where does assessment fit in the big picture of assessment? Really, we can divide assessment into 2 big areas. There's large-scale assessment and classroom assessment. Large-scale assessment helps systems learn. provides evidence to inform policy and programming decisions. And it provides accountability. In other words, assurances that students are learning what they should be learning and at an appropriate level of efficiency and correctness. Classroom assessment is divided into two areas: assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Assessment of learning is the one that most of us are familiar with, so let's start with that one. Assessment of learning is evaluative. In other words, the teacher assigns a mark or a grade to indicate the quality of the work. It occurs at the end of the learning, and it's used to make summative decisions. Decisions about how well a student has progressed towards standards, or decisions about placement as a result of the evaluation. Assessment for learning is quite different. It's non-judgmental. There are no grades or marks given. It occurs during the learning. And it empowers the learner to become actively involved in the assessment process, so that eventually he becomes self-directed and self-regulated. It really parallels, move this back a bit, it really parallels that shift in pedagogy where our students now are active participants in constructing their own learning. We're going to do a little activity now, which I think demonstrates very well just how far we have come in our understanding of assessment. But in order to do this activity, I'm going to need some help. And judging by the response that I noted yesterday, I think this crowd is the type of crowd who is really interested and really committed, and I don't think I'm going to have any trouble getting 8 volunteers. I hope I'm right about that. Can you hear me? Yes. So what I need is for 8 people to come up here and join me, and I promise you that I will not embarrass anyone. Do I have 8 volunteers? Oh, look at this. Wonderful. The first 4 who make it to the stage, could you sit on the chairs, please? The first 4 are going to be judges. We're going to perform a little activity where some students are going to demonstrate their learning. So we've got 4 judges, wonderful. The next 4 people, if you could remain standing. Oh my, I only have 3. I need 1 more. Is it you? Thank you very much. Come on down. Make sure to bring your headset. Oh, now I think I have too many people. That's okay. You can be the 5th judge. Would you please sit? Thank you. Sí. Venga aquí, por favor. That's wonderful. So everyone's got their headsets on and you understand what we're doing. All right. We are going to do a little clapping activity. So no pressure. All you're going to have to do is clap. But what I'm going to ask is that 3 of the students leave the auditorium for just a couple of minutes. And I have an assistant here, Amy Coupel. She's going to take you out of the auditorium and she'll let you know when you can come back in. Yes. Hasta la vista. are student number 1. And in just a second, I'm going to ask you to clap for 15 seconds. I'm going to time you, okay? Try to make it a really good clap, because these 5 people are going to judge you on your clap. And if you clap really well, they're going to give you a 4. And if you clap at an acceptable level, they're going to give you a 3. If you're just kind of approaching the standard of good clapping, they're going to give you a 2. And if you're well below the standard, they're going to give you a 1. Do you understand? Judges, do you understand what you have to do? At the end of the clapping, you're going to raise your hand and indicate level 1, 2, 3, or 4. And your name is? Umberto. All right, Umberto, you may begin clapping now. Oh, okay, I'll give you some more time. Well done, Umberto. Could we give Umberto a round of applause? Now, judges, think for a moment about Umberto's clap. And now, if you would please raise your hand to let us know what level you think Umberto clapped at. Just raise your hand, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Oh, look at this, Umberto, you've really impressed somebody. We have a 4, we have a 2, we have a 3, we have a 2, we have a 3. Not bad for your first try at clapping. Thank you very much. You can go back and sit down. And now, Amy, if you bring in student number 2. Now this time, judges, our student is going to clap, but I would like you to talk quickly for a moment after the clapping and collaborate on one score. And then I'm going to ask you to give this student a little bit of feedback. Tell this student one thing they did well and one thing they need to work on. Okay? Hello. Your name is?
Verónica. Verónica.
Beralina? Oh, Beranica. Beranica. Ah, welcome. Okay, Beranica. In just a moment, you're going to clap for 15 seconds. But it has to be the best clap you've ever done, because the judges are going to judge you on your clapping. But don't worry, because they're going to give you a grade, but they will also give you one thing to work on. They'll give you a suggestion, and they'll tell you one thing you did really well. Are you comfortable with that? All right, you're going to clap for 15 seconds, Veronica. So if you could begin now. Thank you very much. A round of applause for Veronica. So judges, very quickly, if you could just get into a little huddle and figure out the score you're going to give. One thing Veronica did well and one thing she can work on. Could I ask one of the judges to speak for the group? Who would be willing to speak for the group? Could you please tell us the score, and then one thing to work on and one thing Veronica did well?
Bien, primero felicitarla porque al principio estuvo nerviosa, pero luego vimos su desenvolvimiento y lo hizo muy bien. El jurado ha decidido ponerle puntaje 4 y recomendarle de que supere los nervios y tenga un poco más de confianza y hacer un contacto visual con las personas. Felicitaciones.
¿Es verdad? Gracias. And Amy, if you could bring in student number 3, and judges, just so that you're prepared for this time, before student number 3 claps, you're going to let the student know the criteria that you're going to use to judge their clapping. And I have an assistant, Stephanie, venga aquí, por favor. So Stephanie's going to be our recorder, and we'll just write down a few criteria. So you can speak in Spanish because Stephanie's just going to write this in Spanish. So could you please tell me what criteria are you using to judge the clap?
El entusiasmo, la seguridad con la que empieza a hacer lo que se le pide.
La energía.
Actitud.
La alegría y la capacidad de convocatoria en el aplauso al público.
Gracias. And one more.
Naturalidad y contagio.
That's wonderful. So student number 3, if student number 3 could come to the stage. Oh, are you student number 3? Oh, sorry. I didn't realize you were already there. We're getting ahead of ourselves. ¿Cómo se llama?
Vanessa.
Vanessa. Okay, Vanessa, come on over here. Now, in just a couple of minutes, you're going to clap for 15 seconds. And these judges are going to judge you on the quality of your clap. And they have criteria that they're going to use to judge you. So we're going to share that with you so that you know what they're expecting. So this is the criteria that they're going to judge you on. Entusiasmo, energía, actitud, alegría, naturalidad, contacto con el público. Do you understand the criteria? Good. In addition to giving a score this time, judges, you will also tell Vanessa 2 things she did well and 1 thing she needs to improve. Do we all understand? All right, Vanessa, 15 seconds of clapping beginning now.
Bien, chicos, vamos a hacer los aplausos. Les voy a enseñar el aplauso de la lluvia. Empezamos. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much. All right, judges, just take a moment quickly.
And you have about 30 more seconds to make your decision. Who will speak for the group? Gracias.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Bueno, buenos días, soy Eduardo. Vanessa, ¿verdad? Te queremos felicitar porque hemos coincidido en que te vamos a dar 4 y si hubiera un 5, tal vez un 5. Muy bien tu creatividad. Es algo que nosotros conocemos lúdicamente, el jueguito del 1 y del aplauso de la lluvia. Creemos que es fundamental que tú sepas sobre qué te íbamos a calificar. Y fue un reto, queremos felicitar esto, queremos felicitar tu creatividad y tu capacidad de improvisar en el momento. Pero eso es, por decirlo así, herencia de tu bagaje, ¿no? Si tú no sabías esa dinámica no lo hubieras hecho. Y queremos sugerirte que sigas así y mantengas como has hecho el saludo a las personas y al igual que nosotros te dimos recomendaciones, les digas a ellos qué cosa iban a hacer porque estaban involucrados contigo en lograr tu objetivo. Gracias.
And now we'll have our final student. And this time, we're going to empower this student. We're going to encourage this student to become self-regulated and self-directed. Venga aquí. ¿Cómo se llama?
Buenos días, Marta Luisa, de Atunca.
Marta, come on over here. So you've got your headset on, so you know what I'm going to be saying to you. In just a second, you are going to clap for 15 seconds. Yes. And after you clap, we're going to ask you to assess yourself and tell us how you think you did. Now, you need to focus on these criteria because you need to judge yourself on these criteria, okay? So you can just read through that list very quickly. Have you got them all? Okay. Now, what I would like you to do is to add one more criterion that you think is important that isn't on there yet. Can you think of anything? Anything that's not there that maybe should be included? Or are you satisfied with everything? You're satisfied? So is that an extra criteria? Oh, okay, then put that down. All right. So now you need to think about all the criteria, including the one that you have added. And then these judges are going to talk to you. The judges are going to talk to you about your judgment, about what you have evaluated yourself as. Okay? All right, here we go. So, you have 15 seconds. Begin now. Well done, well done. Now what I would like you to do is comment to the judges. They're kind of like your teachers. I would like you to let them know how well you think you did based on that criteria.
Ya, sobre el aplauso y cómo fue. Me encuentro entusiasmo, bueno, de 0 a 20, ¿sí? Con número. Bueno, pienso que puedo tener un 16 de repente. En energía, ¿sí? En energía puedo tener un 17 de repente. En actitud puedo tener también otro 17 de repente. En alegría un 18. En naturalidad un 16. En contacto con el público, ustedes lo dirán. Y en amistad, bueno, no con muchos, pero Gracias a Dios que estoy acá para conocer muchas cosas y a muchos colegas. Gracias.
Listo. Ah, muy bien.
Soy docente de primaria, me llamo Marta Luisa Chón Fajardo. Yo soy iqueña, nazqueña, pero me encuentro trabajando en la ciudad de Piura, en el Colegio San Gabriel, en el nivel primario. Muchas gracias.
Bien, Marta, a todos los criterios que te has calificado, mis felicitaciones, porque es un ideal que tienes, pero también hay que ser realistas. ¿Sí? Bien. Yo sé que tienes bastante energía, pero faltó tener contacto con el público. El público también va a vivir toda esa vitalidad, esa energía, la actitud, la alegría, la naturalidad que las maestras, las educadoras tenemos. Ahí están tus alumnos. Esa sería mi sugerencia. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, participants. You can go back to your seats now.
Listo.
I'm sure you saw how the roles changed, how initially the students didn't even know how they were going to be judged. And by the end, the students knew the criteria, they were involved in developing the criteria, and they had the opportunity to self-assess. Then the teacher commented on the self-assessment. That's what we're hoping for in assessment for learning. Let's move on now and talk about how we do it. We're also going to talk a little bit about the planning and the timing and the amount of this kind of assessment that you try and incorporate into your lessons. There are 4 core practices in assessment for learning: sharing learning goals and success criteria, questioning, feedback, and peer and self-assessment. So let's take a look at that first practice. It's such an important one, and sometimes people just sort of skirt over this one. So I encourage you to think very carefully about what I'm going to be saying next. This is really the first step in developing independent, self-monitoring learners. The research tells us that what teachers think they're teaching and what students think they're learning can often be very different. The same is true for the standards that teachers and students have for quality work. Well, students and teachers need a common understanding of what is to be learned and what successful achievement looks like. So let's talk very carefully about what is to be learned. In other words, the learning goals. We have to be clear in our minds exactly what learning goals are. Learning goals are derived directly from the curriculum. They're stated in student-friendly language. They often break down the curriculum statements into much smaller steps. And the verbs that are used are very specific and observable. So you wouldn't use a word like understand, to understand the Pythagorean theorem, or appreciate, to appreciate the elements of design. That's not specific enough. it would be hard for students to make a decision about how well they were doing using those kinds of verbs. We also state learning goals from the student's perspective. So they are started with phrases like, we are learning, or I can. And you'll notice in your handout, for the learning goals and success criteria for our session, I have placed them in the first person. Here you can see a set of learning goals that was derived from one curriculum expectation. This is an expectation from the Ontario curriculum in mathematics. Simplify polynomial expressions through addition and subtraction. There's actually 4 different goals there. And the special ed teachers in the audience, I'm sure, will be familiar with this because we used to do this in special ed and call it task analysis. We can break down that one expectation into the goals that you see on the screen there. First of all, you have to be able to identify a polynomial expression. Then you have to be able to identify like and unlike terms. Then you can group those terms. And then finally, you can add and subtract the terms to make the expression simpler. Now, because students' understanding of learning goals is so important, you have to make sure that they're front and center. And here's another mistake sometimes teachers make. They simply display them in the classroom or state them at the very beginning of the lesson. Students aren't going to internalize the goals if that's all you do. You need to give the students an opportunity to talk to one another about the goals, to write about the goals. And the teacher needs to reference the goals throughout the learning. And when possible, you should co-construct the goals, students and teachers working together. So let's take a look at the process for co-constructing a learning goal. What you see on the screen is a curriculum statement, again from the Ontario curriculum. And this time it's a writing curriculum statement, and it's quite long and involved. So if you were co-constructing this, or looking at this expectation and co-constructing goals with students, the first thing you would say to yourself as a teacher is, I'm going to start with a curriculum statement and I'm going to break that curriculum statement down into easier statements in student-friendly language. So once you've got that in your head, you begin with your students. So if you were my students, I would focus on the key words and I would ask for replacement words that were simpler. So in this case, the key words would be vivid language. So I would say to the students, well, is there a simpler way to say vivid language? And they might say, well, if you use adjectives and adverbs and action words, that would make it more vivid. And then you would go on and say, figurative language. Is there a simpler way to say that? And the students might say similes, metaphors. And then you might go on to the word interest. And you might say to the students, is there a simpler way to say that? Well, it means that you want to be part of it. It appeals to you. It's interesting. So that would be the first step. Then you would take a look at all the words that you think the students understand and just simply get them out of the way. So in the example that you see on your screen, all the words that the students would understand are in italics. And then finally, you would ask if there were any hard words there that the students needed to make simpler. And in this case, they might say, well, expressions. I'm not quite sure what expressions means. So you have a conversation about the fact that expressions are phrases. They're a collection of words. Once you've gone through all those steps, you can start rewording. And this is what you would come up with. I can make my writing more interesting by adding adjectives, adverbs, and action words, similes and metaphors, creative phrases. Now, setting clear goals is extremely important, but we have to go further. The success criteria by which the student work is judged must also be very clear, and Shepard's work has shown that very, very clearly to us. Sometimes success criteria is simply introduced by the teacher, and there are several strategies that the teacher can use if that's the method that the teacher has chosen. What's of utmost importance is that the success criteria is stated clearly and specifically. The teacher can encourage the students to ask questions to clarify their understanding. The teacher can take a sample of student work and apply the criteria to the sample. Or even better, the teacher can give the students a sample of student work and have the students apply the criteria to the sample. Here's an example of how a teacher might introduce some criteria to a class and then apply the criteria to a sample. So I'm going to be the teacher and you're going to be my students. All right, students, today we're going to learn about how to design a name tag. But before we begin, I would like to tell you what a good name tag looks like. And so what you see on the screen there are the success criteria that would make the name tag you make a very good name tag. So the first thing is the name should stand out. Your eye should be drawn to the name. It should be the focal point. Secondly, the printing should be very clear. Make sure it's bold and crisp. Thirdly, there should be a simple design around the border and in a bright color, but nothing to distract from the name, because remember, the name is what should really stand out. Now, are there any questions? Do you understand the criteria? Good. Well, what I'll do now is apply that criteria to this sample. The name is what stands out. Oh yes, for sure, that name is the first thing I'm drawn to. The printing is clear. Yes, I would say the printing is clear because it's crisp and bold, and that black makes it very clear. There is a single color around the border in a bright color. Yes, I would say that this name tag matches that criteria. So that's how a teacher would introduce and apply. Now here's an example of how a teacher might get the students to look at a sample and apply the criteria to the sample. So you're going to be my students, and I'm going to ask you to read through that criteria, and then I'd like you to turn to a partner and just talk about how well this sample matches that criteria. I'll give you about a minute to do it. Go ahead now. Okay, so I think you got a bit of a flavor for that. Now, as previously mentioned, sometimes the teacher just introduces the criteria to the students, but it's much more powerful if the students can actually co-construct the criteria with the teacher. And this is what you see on the screen now. This process was developed by the authors that you see I have quoted there. So in this case, what the students would do is brainstorm together, what does quality look like? So if they were generating the criteria for a lab report, for example, they would say, what does a good lab report look like? What does quality look like? Then, once all the ideas were out, they would see what ideas went together, put them into categories, name the categories. Then they would take all that information and put it into a chart. All the while understanding that they would be adding and revising and refining as they used that criteria. So here we have an example of a brainstorming session that a class did because they were going to make event posters for a school dance or a picnic or a fun fair. So the teacher asked, what counts on an event poster? And what you see there are all the criteria that the students generated. And once the criteria were out there, the teacher said, well, can you tell me which of those things go together? And sure enough, they were able to put certain concepts together, and you can see we grouped those by color. Then we named the categories. Well, after all that sorting and categorizing was done, the criteria looked like this. So much easier for the students to understand. You can make this process that I just talked about even more powerful if you introduce student work into the mix. And just as I used different qualities of samples a few minutes ago in the name tag activity, it's a good idea to use different samples of varying qualities. And then the students can identify what was done well and what needs improvement in each sample. And that helps them to generate a list of elements that makes some samples better than others. Then they do the sorting and categorizing, they make the chart, always with the understanding that they're going to add, revise, and refine. Now, just as we mentioned with learning goals, you have to make sure that success criteria is front and center. It has to be an integral part of the learning process. So you need to display it in the classroom. You need to reference it when feedback is given. You need to include it on feedback templates, and we're going to look at a few of those in just a minute. Why do I stress this? Because it provides students with a clear picture of what they're aiming for. And it gives students and teachers that common language that they need to communicate about their learning. Here we see a feedback form that identifies the success criteria and then references the criteria in the feedback given. That's so important. You've got to use the language of the criteria when you're giving the feedback. Here's an example of a slightly more elaborate form where more detailed comments can be made, but the focus is still on the success criteria, and the language that is used is consistent with the criteria. So you can see on this particular form, this is criteria for the event poster, and we're looking at Claudia's work, and Claudia is on track for most of the criteria. She needs to do a little bit more work, but in addition to just giving that information, the teacher has also given additional comments, and again relating to the language of the criteria. Adjectives like sizzling are exciting, and the criteria was words create excitement. You'll notice there's also a space on this form for comments, and those comments can be made either by the teacher or the peer or the person who's actually done the work. In this case, it's the teacher, and the teacher's trying to stretch Claudia a little and ask her to think about other colors that she could use, because she still has some work to do in that area. We're going to move on now to the second core practice, which is questioning. Questioning is such an important aspect of instruction and assessment because it really makes students' thinking visible. The research tells us some very interesting things about questioning. Did you know that 60% of the questions in a classroom are closed questions? That means that they have a right and a wrong answer. They really just look at students' recall. There's not much deep thinking. An example would be, what is the capital of Peru? 20% of the questions that are asked in classrooms are procedural questions. They just have to do with classroom management. Does everybody have their book out? 20% of the questions that are asked in classrooms are open questions. And those are the ones that we really need to think about, because those are the ones that require deep thinking on the part of the students, and they provide a window into what the students are thinking. They also keep students more engaged. Closed questions certainly have their purpose for things like trying to get an idea of how much prior knowledge students have, or for reviewing work quickly. But open questions have a far greater purpose. Just to give you a flavor of that, I'll state a closed question and turn it into an open question. Closed question. What town did the characters in the story live in? Open question. Why is it that the characters never left the town? Do you see the difference? You're going to get much richer answers and really find out what students are thinking if you ask that open question. I'm sure you'll all agree that it takes a lot of practice to get skillful at questioning. So we're just going to talk for a few minutes about effective questioning. One of the first things we all need to remember is to plan questions in advance. That way we'll ask fewer questions, but better questions. Questions that are more strategic, that focus on learning goals, and that anticipate misconceptions. Here's an example of how important it is to anticipate misconceptions in advance of your teaching. Take a look at that first question there. Order these fractions from least to greatest. 5, 6, 11, 12, 1/3. Answer, 1/3. 5, 6, 11, 12. Well, a student could get the right answer even if she thought that you simply had to look at the numerator in order to order those fractions. Now, a teacher who anticipated that kind of misconception would ask the second question. Right away, the teacher would be able to spot the students who had faulty knowledge and take the steps to help those students improve their learning. We need to remember that the purpose of asking questions is to explore and expand student responses so we know what they know and what they need to learn, because that helps us in our next steps of teaching. And there are many research-based strategies that can help you to do that, and I've listed several of them on the screen. I'm just going to go through them very quickly, and what I'll do is just simply give you an example. You can ask for clarification. What do you mean by sticking them together? You can encourage expansion. Could you explain that a little further? You could ask for a rationale. Why do you think that's important? You could affirm effort. Tommaso, I really liked the way you paused before you answered that question. You really thought about it. Allow extra thinking time. There's actually 3 strategies here. The first one is postponing, where you ask a student a question and you can see that they are hesitating. And so you say to them, oh, I'll get back to you. You ask a couple of other students, and then you go back to the first one and you say, what do you think of what your classmates have said? Pausing before you elicit a response. The research says you should wait 3 to 5 seconds after you've asked a question before you get the students to respond. You'll get much deeper thinking that way. And it's the same thing after a student responds. You shouldn't say anything as the teacher for 3 to 5 seconds. Gathering. Let's take what Arturo said and see what goes with that. Asking for analysis. What are the connections here? Redirecting. Let's take what Maria said and see if we can build on that. Synthesis. How could we combine those ideas? Summarizing. Let's take what Miguel said and what Claudia said. What's the common theme here? Always trying to get at the student's thinking. There are 3 more strategies that you can use to really get students to reveal their thinking. And of course, that's the purpose of the master teacher. The first one is the think, pair, share strategy. And I know that you are familiar with that one, so we won't spend any time on that one. Another one is the no hand strategy, where you simply say at the beginning of the lesson, you don't need to raise your hand, I'm going to call on you. That keeps students engaged, it keeps them thinking. You just have to make sure that you give that wait time and that you allow the students to pass if they don't know the answer. The 5-finger strategy, that's the one where at certain points in the lesson you might just say to the students, okay, give me a reading on how much you know, how much you understand right now. 1 if you don't know anything, 5 if you're really clear. So the students raise their hands and the teacher knows at a glance what the next steps in the teaching should be. Let's move on to our third core practice, which is feedback. This is the information that students and teachers share during the learning. Now, this particular aspect has been highly researched. Black and William did a landmark study in 2003 where they looked at several other studies. And they found that descriptive feedback is the most powerful tool for improving student learning. Note it's descriptive feedback. That's the operative phrase there. It's not evaluative feedback where you assign a mark or a grade. The research tells us that frequent evaluation and grading can have a negative impact on motivation and learning. But specific, timely, descriptive feedback improves learning and increases engagement. Now, we're often asked, well, how much feedback should we be getting? And we always say, think about the quality of the feedback. That's what counts. Feedback focuses on learning goals and success criteria, rather than on behavior or personal attributes. So you wouldn't comment on the effort that someone had put into an assignment. That really isn't effective feedback. You focus on the evidence. You identify what was done well, what needs improvement, and most importantly, how to improve. Or you can engage in a learning conversation where you ask the student about their learning and see if they can consider some next steps. It's important when you're giving feedback to remember that less is more. Feedback really should be limited to 2 or 3 recommendations related to the learning goal. You also have to think about when and how you're going to give the feedback, and when and how you're going to monitor the student's response to the feedback. We call this intentional planning of the feedback loop. There are all different ways to give feedback. Feedback can be given orally, simply by commenting on one of the criteria that has been met. Either a teacher or a peer could do that. Feedback can be given in written form, and there are lots of templates that will allow you to do that in a very efficient way, and we're going to look at some of those in just a second. You can have a learning conversation where you not only give the feedback, but you talk to the student about the feedback. Or you can give feedback in groups. You give it to groups of students with similar strengths and needs. That way it saves you some time. When do you give the feedback? Well, it has to be at critical checkpoints while the students are learning. Timing is everything. Brookhart has coined a phrase, just-in-time feedback, and a lot of our practitioners use that phrase. You need to give the feedback while the students are learning so that they have an opportunity to improve. Here's an example of a feedback form where the teacher could give feedback very, very quickly. If you're on target, we check it in the bullseye, and if you're not, we put it in the other column. The students know exactly what they need to do. Here's a sample where we use an acronym to list the criterion. So the first letter of each criterion in English actually spells a word. So it's easy to remember the criterion or criteria. And whoever's giving the feedback, the teacher or the student, just takes a sticky note and just writes the letter of the criterion if the student has met the criteria. And then there's room to actually suggest next steps or to affirm that some work has been done well. It's very important to remember that feedback needs to feed forward. I'm not sure how well that translates in Spanish, but we have to remember that there has to be an expectation for the students to improve. And you must make sure that you give them time to improve, and you have to make sure that you monitor that improvement. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay. I'm just going to speak for one moment on grades versus feedback. I invite you to take a look at Butler's work. He did a very interesting study where he found that students perform best and are most engaged when comments alone are given. I'm sure that would surprise some of you. Let's move on now to the last core practice, which is peer and self-assessment, or assessment as learning. Some people think this is a separate category, but really it is part of assessment for learning. It's the ultimate goal. What you're hoping in the end is that students are going to assess themselves. But you have to remember that this skill has to be taught explicitly. It doesn't just happen. So the teacher has to model it using samples. The students can actually be given samples of student work and talk about how the work matches the criteria. The students can use feedback templates that incorporate the entire cycle. And I'm going to show you one of those right now. Here we have an example where Maria has given herself feedback, and then a classmate has given her some feedback, Arturo, and then the teacher gives feedback, and then Maria goes back and acts upon the feedback. And she even makes a comment at the bottom to summarize what she has done in response to what her teacher and her peer have pointed out to her. There are all sorts of ways to promote assessment as learning, and I've listed several of those for you on the screen. I'm not going to go through them. Instead, I'm going to show you some examples. So here's an example of a feedback log where the student gives himself feedback and then the teacher comments on the student's feedback. And always, always referring back to the success criteria, both in the case of the student and the teacher. Here's an example where the student self-assesses over time. So the student has to actually pick out samples of their work that demonstrate that they're reaching their learning goals. Here's an example of a reflection journal where the student reflects on what he's learned in terms of using a formula for calculating perimeter instead of just doing it the long way. At the end, he talks about what he needs to do better and how he's going to go about doing that. In this sample, we've gone back to that acronym, and we have a student giving feedback, and then a peer giving feedback, and then a student giving feedback again, and then at the very last part of the form, we have the student goal setting, deciding where he is at the moment, where he needs to go, and how he's going to get there. When you engage students in assessment as learning, eventually they learn to set their own goals. And of course, that's what you're aiming for. But to get the students really good at this process, you need to ask questions like, where are you now in your learning? Where are you going? How do you get there? The students need some prompting in order to become really proficient at this. We've already talked about self-reflection and how important that is. So on the screen you see some questions again that you can use with students so that they think about their thinking. Now, in terms of planning, I know I don't have very much time left, but I think I can actually do this quite quickly. What you see on the screen is a model of backwards planning that was made famous by Wiggins and McTeague. And you see, you start out with big ideas, and you look at, these are the ideas that you want students to go away with, the enduring understandings that they have long after they leave your course. And then you cluster the expectations that go with those big ideas. And then you identify what the learning goals are going to be. And then you look at what evidence will demonstrate that the students have met the goals. Then you look at what good work looks like, success criteria. And then you decide on the activities that will help the students to produce the evidence. The key is, all the while you're doing that, you're asking yourself the questions that I have put all around the outside of that design. Questions like, when to introduce goals and success criteria. Often it's at the beginning of the lesson, but not always, because if you're doing an inquiry, you don't do it that way. How will students internalize the goals and success criteria? Will you get them to write them out? Will they talk to one another? You must answer all those questions that you see on the screen. And the key is that you need to do it while you're planning, not afterwards. If you do it while you're planning, then you will integrate assessment for learning throughout the lesson. If you commit to doing that, then great things will occur for your students, because they'll know what they are learning, the learning goals. They'll know what it looks like to learn, the success criteria. They'll know how to assess their learning, self-assessment. They'll know how to set their own goals. They'll know how to monitor their progress. They'll take ownership. They'll become independent. And that's going to result in increased student motivation and achievement. Here's what we're aiming for. If we embrace this approach, and we remember the 3 key points, assessment for learning occurs throughout instruction. Instruction changes based on what assessment for learning tells us. The goal is to shift the paradigm. Right now we're sitting in that first triangle where most of what we do is assessment of learning. And what we want to do is move to the second triangle, where most of the assessment is assessment as learning. Now, I don't think you'll have much time, but I invite you at some point to go back to your handout and take a look at those belief statements and see whether or not you've changed your mind about anything. Also take a look at the goals and the success criteria that I identified for this presentation and see whether or not we met the goals. Thank you very much.